Good morning, everyone. This is Julie LaRocque. You're joining the Everglades Technical Oversight Committee quarterly meeting. And if you could give us just a pause, we're going to let members of the public into the Zoom side of this meeting. So I'm going to wait just a moment to be sure most of you are here, and then we'll get started. Good morning, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started with the August 2022 quarterly meeting of the Technical Oversight Committee. I'm Julie LaRocque with the South Florida Water Management District. I'm going to ask that the TOC representatives each identify themselves. In case you're not watching on video, you can hear their voices. And also that they introduce the folks who we have as so-called panelists here on Zoom who may be speaking up in the meeting, primarily technical people. And there are some attorneys here, and I will personally thank you for being here because, you know, I always have a random question for the lawyers during this meeting. So why don't we start on my right? Donato, if you could introduce yourself and also your technical staff, please.
Good morning, Donato Surratt, Everglades National Park. On the line, we have Bill Walker, represented as William Walker, Dilip Shinde, Dan Scheit, and Robert Johnson, Bob Johnson.
Great, thank you. Ed?
Edward Smith, Florida Department of Environmental Protection. I believe on the line we have Kenny Heyman and possibly Maylene Sotolongo.
Thank you. Dan?
Good morning, Dan Crawford, TOC rep for the United States Army Corps of Engineers, and online we have Brooks Moore and Matt Axtell, and I am still expecting Ken Bradshaw to join shortly as well.
Great, thank you. And Lori?
Yes, good morning. Lori Miller with Loxahatchee National Wildlife Refuge, and Donato has already introduced the DOI technical folks, so that's it.
Great. Okay, well, we'll get there. I have also forgotten to introduce any technical reps I have here. So I've got Chelsea Q and Jody Hutchins and Stuart Van Horn here in the auditorium. And Nenad Arikanen should be on Teams. And attorneys, since we asked for attorneys, Julia Lamonaco, I see her on Teams. So thank you all for joining us. And who did we miss? Judith? No, we got Judith. Did we get everybody? I think? Okay, great. Thank you. So all the folks who've just been introduced or named, with the exception of Mr. Barquette, we're going to get to you, sir, are all able to more easily unmute themselves and engage in the conversation today. If you are logged into the meeting as an attendee, we will get to you during the public comment period, and I will try to look for raised hands throughout the meeting regardless. And so, Mr. Barquette, would you mind saying hello again for the larger group this morning?
Yes, good morning to everyone. This is John Barquette, Special Master.
Great, thank you so much. I don't think I have any other intros for this morning. We've kind of introduced everybody. I do appreciate you guys all coming here today in person. It's nice to see you. I'm not sure I know how to do this with people here anymore, but that's okay. For those of you who are on the phone, please mute, or your computer for that matter, please mute when you're not speaking. And you would want to reduce the volume on your computer to 0 in order to avoid feedback. And please, hopefully you're listening from one source and not multiple sources. I think that'll help you on your end. If you are using your phone, you're going to need to press *9 as a way to raise your hand. If you're fully using Zoom in your computer, I believe there's a button you can push to raise your hand. And if you want to unmute your microphone, again, using your phone, you're going to need to press *6. So *9 will raise and lower your hand, *6 will mute and unmute. not necessarily in that order. We will take public comment before we vote, and comments on everything else we will take at the end of the meeting. We're really happy to welcome everybody here, not only in person, but online using Zoom. It's a great thing that we're able to do, and I think it's a lot better than having people call in on WebEx, which is what we used to do 100 years ago. So happy to make this opportunity available to everybody. Public speakers, we talked about that. If you are here in person in the auditorium and wish to make a public comment, there's a little form for you to fill out. Just to let you know that we talked about raising our hands. We do not use the chat feature in Zoom for these meetings. So we would ask that if you have comments or something that you would normally type into a chat, please raise your hand so you could speak them. And if for some reason you would prefer not to speak them, you can always email us after the meeting. That's always fine. Okay. At the end of the meeting, we're going to take action items for the next meeting. I hope we'll be able to do that today if we have any. And we do have a bunch of stuff on the web, and I usually like to look at the website right here while I'm here, but I've already looked at the website, so I know my list is correct. There'll be instructions for folks participating in Zoom. The final agenda is on the TOC website. In addition, on the main page, we have the first quarter settlement agreement report, which Chelsea will be showing in PowerPoint form later on. We have the quality assessment report for water quality monitoring, as well as the associated data set is also posted out there. We have compliance tracking tables that Tolmo puts together for us. So that includes the refuge total phosphorus compliance table dating back to 2007, provisional Shark River Slough total phosphorus tracking, and Taylor Slough and Coastal Basin tracking. So those are all posted on the webpage. Also, under the link for the read-aheads today, we have draft notes from our last meeting, which was May 10th. The final agenda is there also. We also have, for agenda item 2, we have Chelsea's presentation. And if by any chance you downloaded that presentation like last week, we noticed a couple of minor discrepancies and have reposted it as of Friday, I think, Friday or Monday. The letter says Friday. Okay. So the corrections are there as of Friday. If you downloaded a copy before then, you may see some minor differences on a couple of slides. So I wanted you to be aware of that. Agenda item number 3 is also posted out there. That's the presentation we have from Donato Surratt from the park. So we're looking forward to that. And then agenda item number 4 is the follow-up discussion for Water Year 2021. We reposted Chelsea's presentation from the last meeting in case anyone wanted to refer to it. And then we have the memo from the principals is also posted there, which is the 3 questions. Whenever we say the 3 questions in here, I think we know this is the memo from the principals from, I forgot what year it was, but anyway. A path forward for all of us to keep things moving. So all that material should be on the website. You just let Violetta know somehow that you're not able to get in or some other thing like that, and we'll try to get you covered. All right. Anybody want to propose any modifications to the agenda for this morning?
I do not. This is Lori with the Refuge.
Okay, thank you. Everybody else?
Yep, no revisions from Dan.
Okay, no revisions from any of us, it looks like. Thank you. Okay, next item on our agenda is to consider approving the meeting summary from May 10th. And we continue to try to get these notes as best we can. Does anybody have any revisions or comments or anything we need to fix on the May 10th meeting notes?
I had no comments.
Thank you, Donato.
None from DEP either.
Okay, can we do like a move to approve and second and all that?
This is Dan from the Corps. I have no proposed edits to the minutes, and I make a motion to approve them as is.
And this is Lori. I'll second that.
Okay, great. And I don't think anybody's opposed from what I just heard, so we're good to go with the May meeting minutes. All right, our next agenda item is the first quarter settlement agreement report. So Chelsea Q, please come on down and let us know what you've got to show us.
Thank you. Thank you. First, it's really nice to see the reps here in person the first time. Mr. Barkett, TUC reps, thank you for having me to present the first quarter of 2022 settlement agreement report. So this presentation includes monthly updates for individual month of January, February, March for the refuge, and the 12-month tracking results ending in January, February, March for Shark River Slough and Taylor Slough and coastal basins. So for park inflows, because compliance is assessed on the water year basis and in September, the first quarter ending in March, as halfway through water year 2022. So the 12-month tracking results include data from half of water year 2021 and half of water year 2022. So on this summary table, the top box is for the refuge. So for January, February, and March, we observed the geometric mean TP concentrations were consistently below the long-term levels associated with the stage. Marsh stage had decreased, and we collect 13 to 14 samples each month. For Shark River Slough, in this middle section, the results are still provisional because S12 flows are provisional data. Then for the 12-month period ending in March, the flow mean TP concentration was 11 parts per billion, higher than the long-term limit. The percent of sampling events greater than 10 parts per billion was higher than the guideline for 1.5%. In this bottom section for Taylor Slough and coastal basins, for the 12-month period ending in March, the fluid mean concentration was 4.8 parts per billion, less than half of the limit fixed at 11 parts per billion. And all sampling events TP concentration were below 10 parts per billion. And this slide focuses on the refuge. So here the shaded background represents the monthly stage in the marsh. And this solid red line represents the long-term levels. That's the limit that we need to meet and inverse to stage. So those blue dots represent the geometric mean of samples we collect each month in the marsh and need to stay below the limit, this red line. And here September 2020 had an excursion shown in red dots. The 36-month average of monthly TP geometric mean was 6.8 parts per billion. And so this slide shows the same information, but stretching the limit to a zero line. And we can see more clearly the difference between geometric mean and the limit. So the 3-year average of TP geometric mean was 2.8 parts per billion below the limit. So I've presented these 3 months, the top 3 months for the regular reporting, with preliminary data outlook. You can see the next 4 months. And June 2022 had an excursion, meaning geometric mean TP concentration higher than the long-term level. So move on to Shark River Slough. For the 12-month period ending in March, the total flow was near 1 million acre feet, which resulted in the limit 7.9 parts per billion, and the flow with mean TP concentration was higher than the limit. So for historical compliance status, this solid red line represents the long-term limit, and those blue bars represent the annual flow with mean TP concentration and need to stay below the red line. And the last 2 dark blue bars represent water year 2020 and 2021 using method 1.5. And water year 2020 met the compliance, and water year 2021 had an exceedance. So this slide shows daily flow over the past 3 years. So here, the bottom red line represent the flow at S334 went around the corner to South State. So this, any flow above this red line means net flow that went into Shark River Slough. So for the 6 months in water year 2022, the total flow was 640,000 acre feet, which is about 6 times the flow 2 years ago for the same period, water year 2020, and half of the flow in water year 2021. And water year 2021 was impacted by heavy rainfall and high staging in WCA 3A. So this slide shows the same daily flow information, but on individual magnitude at each structure. So this shows the flow delivered to West Shark River Slough at S12A, B, C, and D from top to the bottom. So S12A and S12B had some small flow in before October, and S12C closed in November, and S12D has been continuing flowing in this water year 2022. And this slide shows flow at the structures discharged into the L29 canal east of S333. So in this segment of canal, 95% of water came from S33 and S33N. In the middle panel for flow at S356, only this yellow shaded area is counted toward compliance because this represents water coming from water conservation areas flowing into Shark River Slough. This slide, actually I've already talked about the red line representing the flow at S334, And above this red line is the net flow sent to the L29 canal east of S333. And this slide shows the biweekly sampling event flow in blue bars and the TP concentration level in cyan dots. And this is the data used to calculate the 12-month flowing mean concentration. So here we see in the water year 2022, flow was quite significant, with the stage decreasing, then TP concentration was increasing, and flow has been in a downward trend. It's the same information, but add a line of blue diamonds represent the moving 12-month flow mean concentration ending in each month. So the last diamond is the TP concentration ending in March, 11 parts per billion. And this slide shows more information. So the WCA3A stage, Shock River Slough inflow, and TP concentrations. So here, this bottom shaded area represents flow delivered to Shock River Slough. And the top, these two solid lines represent a stage in WCA3 in this blue line, and S33 headwater in red. And those yellow dots represent the weekly fluid mean TP concentration. So overall, water year 2022 started in October, marked with relative low stage, high TP concentrations, and significant flow sent to Shock River Slough. Here we see about 10 months of data, only have 2 months left for water year 2022. And the total flow was near 900,000 acre feet. So for the stage S33, the WCA3A stage, here the solid blue line started about 10 feet, which was quite low on October 1st. Then it's just hugged this zone B top line for 2 months, but then fell into zone B completely. Then with the starting of this wet season in June and July, the stage barely stayed in zone A for 1.5 months. Now it's in zone B. So the stage was quite low for this year. And TP concentrations was relatively high, peaked 30 to 40 parts per billion in May. Now it's in a downward trend, stayed around 10 parts per billion. And the flows sent to Shock River Slough has been continually because of the COP implementation, except a 2 weeks gap in May. We move on to Taylor Slough and coastal basins. For the 12-month period ending in March, the total flow was about 280,000 acre feet, and the fluid mean TP concentration was 4.8 parts per billion, less than half of the limit at 11 parts per billion. So for historical compliance status, the annual fluid mean concentration was far below the long-term limit at 11 parts per billion. And this slide shows daily flow over the past 3 years at those structures. So for water year 2022, starting in October, the total flow was about 150,000 acre feet. And 2/3 of flow came from S332D pumping, and the rest came from S18C and G737. So for flow at individual structure, again, S18C and S332D contribute most flow to Taylor Slough and coastal basins, and they have been flowing except for 1 month gap in February. Then flow at G737 and S328 were always much smaller. And this slide shows flows in and out of S332D flowway. Here, the purple shaded background represents flow pumped by S332D pump. And any flow below this red line is excluded from compliance calculation because it's conveyed north by S332DX1 and into the C111 South detention area. This neon green line represents flow at S328, which is a surface water inflow point into Taylor Slough and downstream S332D. And this slide shows the weekly sampling event flow in blue bars and flow mean concentration in cyan dots. So since November 2020, all of the sampling events TP concentration were below 7 parts per billion. Here at a string of blue diamonds represent the 12-month moving fluid mean concentration ending each month. And the last diamond is the 12-month ending in March TP concentration at 4.8 parts per billion. And that's all I have for the first quarter of 2022 report. Thank you.
Thank you, Chelsea. Does anyone have comments or questions for Chelsea?
Hey, Chelsea, great presentation. Can you put your slides back up?
Which slide would you like?
The second to the last one, I think.
Second last, this one or?
Yeah, I guess. You said you referenced 7 parts per billion. They were all below 7 parts per billion. Why did you pick 7 parts per billion to reference? Yeah, because the target there is 6 parts per billion. What was the reference for 7 parts per billion?
What I mean, these are sampling events. Oh, okay. So this shows the sampling event flow weight mean concentration. So every week when we collect samples in the field, since November 2020, that's impacted by Tropical Storm Eta. So you see higher than 10 parts per billion. Other than that, all of the data we collected in near 1.5 years were all below 7 parts per billion. Did this answer your question, or did I?
So you're not using that as some kind of target. You're just saying that they were all less than 7. So it's not relevant to our 6 part per billion target.
You mean the target for the
standard for
the
flows
standard?
going in Shark
The
River Sea.
standard is, I think the long-term standard is 7 parts per billion. This just shows a sampling event, but for the 12-month tracking has been consistent at 4.8 parts per billion. I think I have here.
Okay, guys, first of all, I need to let everybody know there's a little bit of a sound issue in the auditorium, so Donato can say all kinds of wonderful things, and Chelsea might not catch them. And I want to clarify Donato's question, if I could. Okay, so Donato, you were asking about some values that are being shown for Taylor Slough and coastal basins. Did you really mean Shark River Slough?
No, we're talking about Taylor Slough.
Okay,
Our
so,
target there is 6 and not 7 from what I
but the
heard.
limit is 11, so I
Right, the
guess
limit
that's
is
the,
11.
okay.
I was trying to understand where is 7 coming from and why are we using that all of a sudden?
And I think Chelsea did answer that she was just clarifying all the values from a certain date forward were below 7, so, or
Right,
at or
so-
below 7. Okay,
Correct. I understood that. I appreciate it. Thank you.
okay, everybody good here? We love our modern technology sometimes. Does anybody else have comments or questions for Chelsea on her presentation today?
Yes, this is Bill.
Bill?
I have a question on the Shark River Slough. I mean, for the first time in my recollection, flow weighted means 3 parts per billion above the limit. And the major change in the hydrology appears to be the operation of S333 North. So I'm just wondering, are we going to get a discussion of how the system was operated during this period, and especially relative to the COP guidelines and such that were, developed to try to minimize the risk of an excursion?
Hey, Bill, I just want to clarify your comment and question if I could, because I think I heard you say 3 parts per billion, and I'm not sure where that came from. I do suggest that when we look at the annual results for Shark River Slough, we do typically look at operations to see how that might have impacted the levels or the limits. And Chelsea looked at some of that for water year 2021, and Donato, I'm not clear if he has a little bit more on that subject or not for water year 21. Does that help?
Yeah, so are we going to get a detailed discussion of the operation or not? Seems to me to be really relevant. And as far as the 3 parts per billion, I thought it was pretty clear in the table that was presented. But anyway, it's above the limit, so.
Okay, I think I got that, Bill. For water year 2021, we did some discussion at the last meeting, and you could certainly check the notes, and the slides are posted out there, and the slides that Chelsea presented at the last meeting are also posted as a read ahead for today's meeting. I can't say for sure how much of operations Donato is going to get into for today, and I think you might be looking at the preliminary data for the current water year, and we will address that. We will give some preliminary results most likely at the December meeting, and then those don't get finalized until the USGS data on the S12s is final. So I would consider your question to be a preview of coming attractions.
Okay, thank you.
Julie, this is John Barquette. Could we just pull up slide 14?
Okay, we got it.
So just an observation, it's similar to Bill Walker's in a way. Looking at the March data, there was roughly a 3.1 differential. And maybe that will narrow as we get closer to September 30th. But if I'm reading this correctly, at least it looks like still above the long-term limit through July. At least I think I'm reading it correctly when I say that. And so there's just 2 or 3 more months. If there's yet another exceedance this year, and we haven't yet talked about the exceedance from last year and what's going to be done about it, but it would be helpful as we're watching and listening to the next couple of presentations if we also keep our eye on what's happening this year to see if explanations for last year are similar or different. Because I have a feeling, I didn't go back to look to see where we were a year ago or 2 years ago, but it could well be, as you just suggested, that there will be another exceedance. So something is going on that the TSC really needs to figure out and then address consistent with the settlement agreement and the consent decree.
Agreed, and we do recognize that things don't look happy for this current water year. We do kind of want to wait till we have the rest of the data, but we've only got maybe 3 more sampling events actually to add to the water quality data here for the current water year. So you guys are spot on that it looks as though there is a high likelihood of another exceedance. And honestly, Mr. Barquette, I personally also hope that we gather up information from the water year 21 and other data that's being looked at and gathered up here to inform us for water year 22 when the time comes. I agree with you there. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I'm just looking at the obligations at page C4, and I want to be in a position to simply applaud what the TOC does, as opposed to be in a position to have to question whether or not the consent decree is being complied with. So I'm anxious to hear the presentations on last year's exceedance and what's going to be done.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments or questions on Chelsea's presentation?
This is Lori with the Refuge. No questions. Just thank you again, Chelsea, for all the work you do.
This is Ed Smith, DEP. Yeah. Thank you. It was a very good presentation. It was a nice presentation of the data. We appreciate all the hard work that goes into that. I know it's a lot, so thank you for that. No questions though.
Okay, I think we're done with Chelsea, right? Okay, thank you, Chelsea. All right, next up.
Julie, this is the court stenographer. The gentleman sitting next to you that just spoke, he is very soft-spoken. I did get what you said. If you could concentrate on speaking up, maybe. Thank you.
Thank you.
Will do. Thank you.
So let me find your presentation.
All right, next we have Donato. I'm going to turn around and make sure he's actually at the podium, so give me a sec here.
Can it be open as a PowerPoint? I mean a PDF?
It's PDF.
This is not PDF.
This is what you sent me, PDF.
I want the PDF.
Okay, so Donato is going to give his presentation on Shark River Slough water quality compliance evaluation for water year 21.
Thank you. Can you hear me? All right, good morning, everyone. Donato Surratt, Everglades National Park. I will walk you through our evaluation of water year 2021 for Shark River Slough compliance. The way we looked at it, these are going to be my main takeaways. We did look at it from 2 perspectives, looking at the regional and local drivers of the system. So we're looking upstream of S333 as well as what's happening local to the 333 structure. So the first thing that we're coming out here with the regional drivers is we see that there are still nutrients coming down at higher levels. Sorry, apparently my slides aren't being shown. Give me a second.
Is there another place to go here? I'm sorry, I can't fix this.
Do I start over?
Yeah, I think it's playing. This is the, oh, this is not PowerPoint, right?
No.
No.
it's a PDF.
Oh, PowerPoint when you click a play, so I don't know how that.
Do you know how to shut?
Can you not air a PDF? You can't just broadcast the screen?
You'll be broadcasting from the webpage at that point.
I don't know. I want to do it from my PDF. I just want you to broadcast the screen. Can that not be done, Devon?
For those of you who are not with us in the auditorium, please give us a moment while we take care of a couple of technical difficulties, because I think I want you to see Donato's slide. So hang on for a sec, please.
Awesome. Oh, wow. Oh, God. All right, I'm gonna start over. Donato Sarai, Everglades National Park. Hopefully you are seeing our slides now. We're gonna quickly walk through our evaluation of water year 2021 for Shark River Slough compliance. So we have our two approaches that we're looking at, the regional drivers and the local drivers. Under our regional drivers, these are gonna be our main takeaways, and I'll build on these takeaways as we walk through the presentation. So when we look at Miami Canal and the L67A Canal, we still see phosphorus levels that are higher than those that are protective of the park. And those are getting down towards the S333 structure. Total flow weighted mean concentrations, we are still seeing increases in trends over the last decade, particularly at the S9A structure and then on the western boundary of Conservation Area 3A and at S12A. When we look at the flow vectors, we're looking at the hydrology to get an understanding of how water is moving from the north to the south and crossing our boundary into Everglades National Park. And looking at some of the evaluations that the district has done using the RSM regional simulation models. We've tracked those vectors that they have through those models, particularly looking at alternative Q for the COP modeling effort. And we see that there seems to be a pattern of concentrated flows on the eastern boundary that seem to terminate through going through Conservation Area 3 and then terminating down at S12D and 333. Through the central flow path, we do see injection of flows coming in through the northwestern portion of Conservation Area 3, and those waters seem to continue straight down to S12B and C. And then we see connections to Big Cypress National Preserve, where the 330 Conservation Area 3's boundary has that gap and allows water to be connected to Big Cypress National Preserve. And those flow vectors seem to link us directly to the S343s and S12A. And again, I'll demonstrate this in slides as we move forward. We also looked at tracer, a conservative tracer, looking at sodium and calcium ratios to try to understand if the EAA influence is still being observed and water's moving through Conservation Area 3A and then down to the park. And we still see evidence of that. Then we move over to our local drivers and coming specifically to the S333 structure. And we can see we're using basically our threshold of 9.2 feet at the headwater of S333 that we've been discussing for the last few years. And so when I'm looking at conditions, when we're below this 9.2 foot threshold during water year 2021, we see that the concentrations at the S333s, S12, C, and D, they were sitting above 12 parts per billion or at 12 parts per billion during that whole continuous time. Now, this point that I'm gonna make now is you gotta kind of pay really close attention. So I'm gonna talk about one specific structure here, the 333 north flows for the whole water year. And I'm saying during the water year 2021, 53% of that flow was delivered when we were below 9.2 foot. Okay, so that's a substantial amount of the flow for that year. Mind you, 333 North did not flow the entire year, but during the time that it did, most of that flow was happening below 9.2 foot. When we combine the complex together, so the 333 plus the 333 North flows, that was around 42% of those total flows for the whole year were delivered when we were below 9.2 foot at the headwater of 333. Similarly, when we combine all of the structures going into Shark River Slough, again, 42% of that flow was delivered when we were below 9.2 foot. And then the last thing I want to point out from a local driver perspective is we are seeing a relationship with the magnitude below 9.2 foot. There's an inverse relationship between total phosphorus concentrations and how far we are below 9.2 feet. So I'm going to dive into the regional drivers. I'm going to start here with the hydrodynamics. Then I'm going to move to our conservative tracer sodium-calcium ratios. Then we'll talk about spatial distributions of flow weighted mean concentrations. And we'll look at trends over time, looking at water year 2010 through water year 2021, with our water year defined consistent with Appendix A, October to September. Wow. So I can't zoom in on this at all. Okay, so what we wanted to do was look at alternative Q from the COP modeling that was done by the district to give us a better understanding of what the connectivity hydrologically was between Conservation Area 3A and areas upstream and then down to the park. To do that, during our LOSIM evaluations, the Corps and the district identified years that were considered dry years, so 1993. So we picked one of those that they identified, 1993, a normal year, which is 1994, and then a wet year, 1995. And again, we just kind of wanted to see how that pattern would play out under these different conditions. So I'm zooming in here to this, this dry year. And so what I was describing earlier is we see three basic flow paths coming through Conservation Area 3A and ultimately terminating down here into Shark River Slough. So on the eastern side, we'll start there. We see connections coming from Area 2A down through Conservation Area 3, sticking really close to the eastern boundary of it, moving right here along, and you can see all these arrows concentrating near the L67A canal. Some of this water obviously is translating into the canal itself and then being moved down the L67A towards the 333 and the S12D. But we can see through the marsh, we have this strong connectivity of these vectors moving straight towards and terminating at the S12D and 333. We move through the center flowway. You can see all these arrows lining up and pointing right here to the S12B and C. We have this pretty strong injection coming from the western basins into the northwest corner of Conservation Area 3A, and then that water continues down and terminates in the S12B and C areas. And then over here on the western portion, where we're connected to Big Cypress National Preserve, we see this water, which can move right here from, or does move right down that L28I canal, gets discharged directly into the marsh. That water can get connected or caught up into this flow path that we see here with these high concentrations of flow arrows or vectors. And then that water seems to terminate down here at S330, 343s, and then the S12A. And again, that pattern is evident under all conditions. What I'm not showing is like the drier months. These kind of dry up and we start to see higher concentrations of these near the canals. And that kind of indicates that we do see short circuiting of the marsh when we're like in our drier months, such as March, April, and not March, but April and May. So there's connectivity going upstream. So we wanted to examine that a little better by looking at some of our conservative tracers. In this case, we're looking at the sodium-calcium ratios. We have published on this back in 2014, and we did some work here with the district on that connection, and they identified and agreed with that as well back in the day when we were doing this work. It initially got kicked off by Flora back in 1981, so I kind of was just using some of his knowledge and translating that into this publication we produced. The concept here is that the EAA is actually using sulfate or sulfur in their farming practices, so that is one of our sources of sulfur. Calcium is pretty ubiquitous through the system. We're a limestone-based system, so you can expect to see calcium everywhere. The thinner the peat is, the higher the calcium levels, so the more you're exposed, and that's what you'll observe down in the park. But we have a nice peat layer up here in Conservation Area 3, so you don't get as high levels of calcium that you'll see down in the park. So coming off the EAA, we're seeing ratios of sodium to calcium from a molar perspective at 0.8 and higher. When we're in the core of the marsh, Conservation Area 3, we're seeing ratios at 0.34 or less. We have a pretty wide gap between those ratios, and between there gives you an idea that there's going to be some mixing. So in this figure on the right, I've broken down those ratios. The smaller dot or diamond represents 0.34 and below. Between 0.5 and 0.34 is the middle dot, and then greater than 0.5 is the larger dot. What we're seeing here, On the eastern boundary of Conservation Area 3A, we see that mixture. We're higher than 0.5 in most cases. So we're still seeing a pretty strong mixture of water coming off of Conservation Area, out of the EAAs. And that translates all the way onto the eastern boundary, still slightly higher over here at the S9s, as far as the sodium calcium ratio goes. And we can see that signal all the way down here at S333. We don't collect this data at S12D, so I can't tell you that's happening there, but we can jump a little bit further west and you can see we're still seeing a signal over here at S12C. You think back to the vectors that I just finished showing you, we have a pretty strong influence of flows coming down the central flow path and then coming off the marsh, and then from the western side, we have that strong connection. And you can see these ratios tend to be a lot lower, closer to this 0.34 that we're expecting to see coming off the marsh. When we look at the spatial distribution of total phosphorus, I'm looking at flow weighted mean concentrations here at the structures and up here in Miami Canal. This is combining the two stations. A little bit further downstream, you have a hydrology station. But what we can see, the smallest diamond that we have is representing 8 parts per billion, which is our protective target for water going into Shark River Slough. And then, so we grade as we go higher than that. The next highest dot is gonna be 20 parts per billion, and then the largest dot is 150. So our higher concentrations are obviously still coming off the western basins. You can see these sitting at this higher, the bigger dots. When we're over here on the eastern side, the concentrations are all above the 8 that we're looking to see coming to the park. So we're still identifying these as sources that are gonna reach Shark River Slough. And you can see this pattern grade in the total phosphorus concentrations where we have 333s and S12D higher than the 8 that we desire to see coming into the park. We get to the 12C and B, we can see those concentrations are down what we expect to see and are protective. And then when we get far to the west at S12A, we see higher concentrations similar to what we see upstream at the 344 structure. We also looked at trends over time, and this is using the seasonal Kendall tau test, and this is because it's non-parametric data, so we applied that approach. Looking at the water year 2010 through 2021, only trends we're actually seeing are increases over here on the western side, and they're pretty consistent all the way down that western portion of Conservation Area 3A. Over to the east, we do see stable concentrations at the structure S9, but we are seeing S9A concentrations increasing, though the flows coming out of there are a lot lower than what comes from the S9. And then we see we're stable, but high. Again, we're still high at 333s. Stable though, for the 333s, S12B and C and D, but S12A is showing an increase in phosphorus concentration over this period that was selected. So in looking at the summary of all of these components, we are still identifying that there are upstream regional concerns, and those for us have not been ameliorated yet. When we look at the local drivers, again, we're gonna look here at the conditions are gonna be focusing on the 9.2 foot at the headwater best 333. We're gonna look at flow conditions under this configuration, and then we'll look at water quality response, considering total suspended solids and total phosphorus. So here, I kind of wanted to just understand, how is the relationship or the percent of flow that's happening when we're below this 9.2 foot, how is that potentially influencing our experience of compliance over the last few years? So what I've done was take the individual water years, determine how much of that flow happened below 9.2 feet. And I've given you 2 sections here. We're looking at when we were in compliance, but this is obviously not all of the compliance years that we were in compliance, just the most recent. And then I looked at when we were failing to meet compliance. And so these red dots represent when we were not meeting compliance, or the years that we were not meeting compliance. And so what really stands out to me when I look at this figure, again, this is percent flow below the 9.2 threshold, that these bars that are highest on here tend to have a red diamond, a red star asterisk associated with it. There's an exception here to 2017. This for us was a drought year, and we weren't sending much water through there for the most part. Then we had that huge explosion of rain in June, and then we had to open the gates. Concentration shot up to 87 parts per billion at the S333 structure. So that kind of explains why we don't see this high volume of water, but we had the exceedance. There was another odd year here where we had a lot of volume going. We were below the 9.2 foot, so 56% during water year 2011. And this year is more consistent with what we were doing before we started ERTP operations. And at this case, we were still wrapping water around or sending water around Northeast Shark River Slough through 334. And as a result, we weren't moving that water into Northeast Shark River Slough. Thus, it didn't count against us for compliance. But obviously, if we'd included that, we probably would have seen another exceedance. So this is not a perfect metric by any means, but I'm seeing that it's a pattern seeming to evolve out of this type of data. I also kind of wanted to get a better understanding how operations were driving the patterns that we were seeing. So I'm looking at a double mass curve here. On our x-axis, we have cumulative daily rainfall. This is in inches. And then on our y-axis, we have cumulative daily flows going into Shark River Slough. And in the background, you'll see that I have a green line, and that's just the linear model fit to this data to give you an idea when we deviate from the normal pattern that we expect to see. And so what pops out here is during our drought years, particularly 2007, 2008, and then again in 2011 and 2012, you can see that we get rain, but we're not getting a lot of flow that would match that pattern. So we deviate from this line and kind of go long for a while, for 2 years in a row, without getting the same flows. But on the converse, over here up in water year 2021, we are seeing what I think is management actions kicking in, delivering flows when water levels are, when rainfall is a lot lower. And so we're sending substantially more flow than we were doing in previous periods. We kind of looked at the same thing, but changed the rainfall here on your x-axis to stage. And this kind of starts telling the story going back to when we started the incremental test. And you can see here that we are outpacing, going back to 2018, we start outpacing flows with respect to stage. And it starts to get even more dominant in water year 2019, going into 2020 and then 2021. So there's a pattern of us starting to deliver more water while stages are lower, particularly in the canal at the headwater of S333. We also wanted to understand, and we kind of got some of the preliminary data from our 333 sediment characterization study that we're doing right now. Dilip Shinde, who's running that project, was able to give me some of the preliminary data. It was very short stint of data going from June 22nd through December 22nd of 2021. But we wanted to understand what was the influence of the operations of the individual structures. And so we put tilt current meters out into the system, and basically they just tell us which direction the flow is moving when the structures are open. I'm not going to be paying any attention to this one that we have, which is 1,000 foot north of the S333 structure on the L67A, because when we open the structure, it moves water south. What's more interesting is the tilt current meter data that is situated here on the L29 between the S333 structures and the S12s to the west. So the idea here is if we see flows coming through 333, well, what's going to happen to the tilt current meter? Are we pulling water from the west, and is it going through 333 structure? So we'll talk about that from the limited data that we have really quickly. So orient you to this figure really quick. We have water speeds on our primary y-axis and then flows on our secondary y-axis. You can see the period of record that we're looking at is on our x-axis. I'm not going to be focusing on the speed at all, right? We're only looking at this for directionality. So that's why I have this big blue and peach arrow here on the left side. So when we're negative on this plot, we're saying that the water is headed towards the S12s. When we're positive on this plot, then the water in the L29 canal would be moving to the L67A. This black solid line represents that directionality that we're focusing on, and then the dashed blue line represents the combined S12s. I'm sorry, that's just the S12C and D flows during this period. The S12A and B were not open. So what you can see if you just look at the figure really quickly is there seems to be a pretty strong inverse pattern between the flows and the directionality that we're looking at. When we add the 333s combined, that tells more of the story. What you can see here at this period where there's pretty little flow in either direction is we have substantial flow coming through the 333s with minor flow coming through the S12s in this period. As the S12s kick up, you can see this tilt current meter is telling us more of this water is now headed in the direction of the S12s. And even though you still have the S333s flowing. And that pattern persists until we get to the end when the flows from the S12 starts to reduce and S333s has really taken over. But even at this condition, we're really not seeing a strong signal that indicates that these flows are headed towards the S333 structure. So based on this short, limited amount of data, it appears that when the structures are operating in combination, you tend to see more of the flows headed towards the S12s instead of towards the S333 structure from the L29 canal. I oriented you to this type of figure back a couple of years ago when we did our last evaluation. So we're bringing it back. What we're trying to look at right now is the response of water quality to the hydrodynamics that we've been talking about for this most portion. So the first thing I'm gonna look at is total suspended solids. I have 4 panels up here. Each one of them represent total suspended solids on our y-axis. In the background of each of these panels, we have S333 and S333 North. S333 being the open black circle, the solid green diamond is the 333 North, and then the other 2 lines are going to represent different structures on each panel. This will be the same layout for the total phosphorus slide that's coming next. So S12A and B, we didn't have much dynamics happening during this flow peak, which is where I want to actually focus your attention. So we don't have any actual flow data or concentration data for this period. So we move quickly to S12C and D. And so we do have flows happening in S12C at this time. And you can see that that has disturbed the floor, and we see the total suspended solids get kicked up and collected in the sample, consistent to a pattern that we're seeing with the S333 and the 333 North. We didn't have that data for 356 and 152 or the 355, so I'm just gonna move to the next slide. So when we look at the TP concentrations, when we look at the TP concentrations, you can see that, again, focusing here at the end of this period, S333 and 333 North concentrations are peaking out around 30 parts per billion. One of them got to 31 parts per billion. Again, we don't have the S12A and B data during that time. A little bit of 12A data did kick on at the end of this peak when we were coming back down and stages were rising. What is interesting here for me is that we do have the S12C data being signaled here. And if you look at these past peaks, we really weren't flowing to S12C or D, because these are only showing concentrations when they're a flow. So going back to 2016, we weren't really seeing these peaks. But we did have operation of S12C during this period. This is associated with construction activity, so we had to get it open. But what we see is that S12C concentrations did creep up above concentrations down at the 333 and the 333 North. We also see S12D kicked up above it as well. S356, however, was looking pretty gorgeous and staying flat, not responding to pretty much anything over there. So that was nice. So because I looked at this S12C and D contributions to the compliance that we just pointed out on the last slide, I did want to see what their influence on compliance was. So what was their percent contribution? To do that, I looked at it through loads. And this is the basic calculation we use to do the loads. So what stands out, or what I've done first, was to look at the aggregate from 2006 to 2020, and I wanted to compare the dynamics we were seeing in 2021. So what you can see quickly is that S333s combine to make the largest contributor to our loads coming into Shark River Slough, followed by S12D, C, B, and an A. Up here at the top, you'll see that I have these black asterisks, and these are just to give me a significance. So this is a statistical significance that was evaluated using Mann-Whitney. And you can see that there were some significant differences for this longer period relative to water year 2021 for S12C and D, but the difference was a decrease. So I was kind of surprised to see that. We did get a reduction in influence or contribution from the S12C and D during water year 2021 relative to the longer period of record. I also told you I was going to talk about how water quality seems to be responding to these stage dynamics, particularly once we're below 9.2 feet. So what I'm presenting here is that difference between this 9.2 feet and where we actually are stage-wise. So that's represented on your x-axis, and then on your y-axis we have the phosphorus concentrations. So there's an inverse relationship here. You know, the further we go below this 9.2 stage threshold, the higher our concentrations creep up. And using this data going for the period 2006 to 2021, we see that we're explaining around 46% of the variability in the total phosphorus concentrations with stage as it declines. We look specifically at water year 2021, that the variability being explained almost doubles. We're up here at 77% of that variability being explained. So this is concerning because this is the dynamics we're going to be having going forward. It's defined under ERTP, under COP. We're going to have lower stages, and so that's what we're looking at. So in summary, as I started, we looked at the regional and the local. From the regional perspective, we have our Miami Canal, and the S9 structure is still showing that we have elevated total phosphorus concentrations relative to protective levels going to Shark River Slough. We still see increasing concentrations coming through for total phosphorus coming through the S9A, and then on the western boundary of Conservation Area 3, and then down at S12A itself. We see flow vectors are showing us that there are 3 particularly solid paths of flow through Conservation Area 3 and then terminating at the individual structures. And then our sodium-calcium ratios are still indicating that there are influences of water coming off the EAA down at the S333s and the S12s, particularly S12D and C. So when we come local to the structure S333s, we are seeing that the TP concentration at S12D and 333, I didn't mention this during the presentation, but they began below 8 part per billion. So, started above 8 part per billion. So we didn't start off in the greatest condition. And then we immediately moved into sending substantial amounts of flow when we were below 9.2 feet, when we expect concentrations to start creeping up. In the past, we've diverted this water around Northeast Shark River Slough and sent it around to South Dade, so it hadn't hurt us in compliance. But now, water year 2021, we're seeing all of that water being incorporated. And this is great for our ecology because we need this water. So we're going to have to do something about dealing with the nutrient loads that's associated with it. And another dynamic associated with this 9.2 foot was all the concentrations for the S12, CD, and 333 were above 12 parts per billion when we were delivering these waters. The dominant contributor to Shark River Slough total loads still remains the 333 complex, and it's related to the low water stage operations. And relative to the long-term records, the S12C and 12D, they did contribute, their contributions to the this year's compliance was lower than it had been in previous years. So what we're wanting to see as we go forward is we want to continue our long-term solutions that we already are trying to accomplish. You guys, the district is performing the restoration strategies. We need to continue with backfilling the canal in the Miami Canal. We need to get to our Blue Shanty flowway where we're sending water through Conservation Area 3B. We also need to finish our sediment characterization study and then our hydrodynamic studies, because we're looking at these to inform our solutions going forward, any type of engineering solutions we're looking at. And then finally, something that we learned this year, and you guys were hinting on it earlier, is that in water year 22, we have these COP adaptive management strategies, but we weren't able to initiate it this year. The trigger in December is a 3-stage average of 10 or less at the December 1st, and we were sitting at 10.3, so we couldn't initiate it. And the idea there would have been to try to figure out how to slow or reduce recession rates coming out of 3A and then support higher stages in the canal for a longer duration. So we weren't able to implement that, and so we're thinking that we need to go back and reevaluate the approaches of the adaptive management strategies, particularly under SEP 1.0. So with that, I am done with my presentation and open to entertain questions, comments.
Donato, thank you so much. I'm looking to somebody to tell me I'm not too close to the microphone for a change. Does anybody have comments or questions for Donato? I have a whole laundry list, but I'd be happy for someone else to go first.
This is Bill Walker. You really showed a strong correlation along the western side. It's the strongest I've seen. You know, you've identified that before. And to the extent, you know, it just occurs to me, looking just at restoration strategies, I mean, I don't think it's going to have much effect, you know, given that the changes are relative to what's already been accomplished. It doesn't seem like the additional reductions will be large, you know, unless something can be done to STA 5, which the actual performance of STA 5 has not been as good as what was simulated for restoration strategies. But the other project is the other, you know, Western Basin projects that would address the loads coming from the interceptor, L28 interceptor. So, I mean, I guess that's the question about those Western Basin projects. Are they still scheduled and so forth?
So we are in the midst of WERP, or the Western Everglades Restoration Projects planning. And we're on target right now to get a chief's report next year. I'm gonna pass this over to Dan Crawford though, because he's the master there.
Donato, I'll pull up the schedule while you're still answering questions, and I'll answer.
Okay. So Bill, he's going to bring up more information to respond to the Western Basin's topic. Did you have any other question you wanted to, or anything else you wanted to point out while you're on the mic?
Well, I guess the other question is the relative concentrations at S333 North versus S333, because that's the operation of S333 North is one of the major changes that may be contributing. So are the S330 North concentrations higher or lower than 333?
Sorry, when I look at the data, I'm seeing pretty much a 1-to-1 relationship. They separate very slightly, maybe 1 part per billion here and there. I did have high hopes that the 333 North would have been a fix for us, but it's not panning out that way. Seems like there's just a pool of sediment sitting in front of that whole complex, and as a result, we're seeing the dynamics at both of the structures.
And is there any explanation for the trends at S9 and S9A?
I only have a trend at S9A, but I don't have an explanation of it. I only found a trend at S9A. There wasn't one at S9. At S9A, I haven't investigated further what's driving that. Sorry.
But there are SERP projects, at least there were a few years ago, to address that to some extent. So I don't know what the status of those are.
Donato, do you want me to answer that?
Yeah, I would appreciate it. Ed is going to respond to that one.
That's a great observation, Bill. There is a SERP project that's right there by the S9. It's the Broward County Water Preserve Area. I think it's the C11 impoundment. We're working with the Corps right now. We just received their application, so we're going through that to permit that feature. And the goal of that feature is to reduce the reliance upon or the need to use the S9 structure. And so that should, as you pointed out, have a positive effect on the concentrations coming in through that area.
And Donato, just to close the loop, the Corps is expecting a chief's report on Western Everglades in December of 2023. The draft PIR should be on the street in November of 2022. And I think we want to be very clear to note that the Western Everglades project is a component of SERP. It is not a component related to the state's restoration strategy to improve water quality. Over.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Ed.
All right.
Did
Thank
we
you.
have any- You're good? Okay. Any other questions, comments? I know Julie has a laundry list, so.
I do have a laundry list, but Lori's waving. Did
Hold
you
up,
want to
hold
go
up.
ahead, Lori?
Hold up, Special Master's talking. Hold up.
Before or
Hey,
after?
Donato, this is Nenad, not the
Mr.
special
Barnett
master.
also?
Can you guys hear me?
I hear you now.
Oh, Nenad, we didn't call on you, but you can speak. Thank you.
Donato, can you go back to slide 5?
Lori, I'm opining that Nenad might be
I
asking
can't
some
see the
of my
slide
laundry
number, so
list.
can you tell me when I come to it?
Hold on, let me see. Yeah, I think you passed it up. It's the regional driver slide. That's the one right there. Okay, up at the top, you say sodium, calcium, molar ratios. Do you mean molar or normal?
Molar,
So you didn't do milli equivalents.
milli equivalent, sorry, yes.
Okay. And you base those ratios on, or you compare those ratios to Flora and Rosendahl in 1981.
Well, he established them, so.
Yeah, I looked at that document, and it seems to me, based on the table that he's got, table 2, that those ratios were not derived as milli equivalents, but as milligrams per liter. So you may want to go back to it and check the map that they did, but it looked like they did it in milligrams per liter.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I definitely went and talked to Flora back when we were developing the 2014 report. We had a long discussion about that, and we concluded that the better approach would be the milli equivalents.
Yeah, so you could be off by up to 14% on your comparison. The other thing is I noticed that you don't have any sodium calcium data within water conservation area 2A, that you've ended pretty much at the structures. I've looked at the sodium calcium ratios there, and they're extremely high. And part of the reason that they're that high is there's an upwelling due to a hydraulic head in water conservation area 1 that's pushing relic seawater concentrations up into water conservation area 2. So that may be also a contribution to the high sodium calcium ratios. The other thing is, I'm not sure that calcium is that conservative. Calcium is can change due to biological activity. And unlike most salts that will dissolve at higher temperatures, calcium carbonate would actually precipitate at higher temperatures due to the solubility of CO2 in water. So as the solubility decreases, the precipitation of calcium carbonate tends to increase, and that typically occurs in warm waters. So I'm not sure whether sodium calcium ratios are that conservative, considering that calcium is not a conservative ion with respect to sodium. Have you looked at potentially ionic compositions of water as opposed to looking just at sodium calcium ratios to get a better idea of where the sources of water may be coming from with common ionic compositions?
Yeah, back in the period when we were all evaluating this, we did look at the different ionic compositions, and we even had Paul Julian do his triangle diagram that looked at all of that. And then we ended up
diagrams?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, one of the things that I presented recently was that there was a significant decrease in conductivity in Lake Okeechobee from the 1970s to present. And the sodium calcium ratio in the lake was over 1 in the early to late 70s and into the early 80s, and then it went down to about 0.6. At the same time, sodium potassium ratios were around 21, and that's an indication of a seawater source. So I'm not sure that you can just say it's EAA. It's coming from the EAA. The EAA is affected by whatever the groundwater is like below it. And I think the RUB in 2004 indicated that there's evidence of potential sources of seawater into the EAA canals, and those extended all the way back to prior to major agricultural operations in the area. So you may want to think about that the source may be something that is ubiquitous to the area and maybe more natural than just agricultural activity.
Okay, I appreciate all of those comments, particularly the one coming out of Area 2A. I definitely haven't investigated that recently, so I appreciate that. We will look into that a little further. Thank you.
This is Bill again. I don't think we can infer from the high sodium to calcium ratios at the S11s that it's directly linked to the phosphorus issue, because the flow responsible for those high ratios, as you said, comes from groundwater, which has a filtering effect on phosphorus. And that, moves through the whole 2A marsh. And the flows at the S11s are much higher. So I agree that the sodium to calcium ratios at S11 are probably a contributor of the load of this parameter, but I don't think we can infer it's the same for phosphorus.
Okay, thank you. I do want to just note very quickly, we have a member of the public with their hand raised, and I see that, and we will get to you.
This is John Barquette. Donato, on your very last slide, was the ask intended to be the response required at page C4 of the consent decree of the appendix?
Yeah, that's the idea, is we want to move forward, continue with our sediment characterization hydrodynamic studies to inform how we move forward. Yes, that is linked to Appendix C's response. No, we haven't asked the question yet, sorry.
I'm just reading the language. If the Parker Refuge phosphorus limits or concentration levels are violated, then additional remedies will be taken, such as expansion of STAs, more intensive management of STAs, a more stringent EAA regulatory program, or a combination of the above. The state party shall not implement more intensive management of the STAs as the sole additional remedy. I'm trying to figure out how the ask relates to that text.
So the idea is that we're going to complete these studies. And so things that we proposed in our separate work group include a couple of different type of engineering solutions to try to deal with the localized issue at the 333 structure. We're looking to use these sediment characterization and the hydrodynamic studies to inform which path we go with respect to those potential engineering solutions. So I'm not at the point where I can answer C yet, because again, we're trying to rely on these studies to help us inform that.
Would you agree that your first bullet is in accordance with page C4 that Mr. Barquette just read? I guess that's kind of, thank you, Mr. Barquette and Nenad, for asking some of my questions, but is that in accordance with the language that Mr. Barquette just read from page C-4, which I think it is? And maybe those other two bullets are not.
If it is, it's not particularly illuminating from just that one bullet. in my mind anyway, if you're going to rely on something that you're doing as a solution to what apparently didn't work a year ago and may not be working this year, you're going to have to go into a lot more detail than a single bullet in a PowerPoint presentation on slide 20.
Okay, I definitely appreciate that. We haven't implemented anything for water year 2019 yet. Again, we're just at the phase where we're studying the conditions so we can figure out how to implement something. So we weren't really comfortable going further than stating what we need to do is continue these studies so we can actually get to the next step of generating the engineering solutions. But I think Julie is correct. I think that the first bullet is consistent with what you're suggesting we need to be focusing on, which is letting restoration strategies play out so we can start seeing improved concentrations coming down the system.
Well, the language of the agreement is additional remedies will be taken. This bullet says continue implementing long-term solutions. That is not something that will be taken. You're referring to something that's already been done that apparently hasn't worked yet.
So restoration strategies.
I'm not trying to be critical. I'm trying to be helpful, but I think you're going to have to be a bit more fulsome if you're going to comply with your obligations under this decree.
Thank you.
Donato, Mr. Barquette, this is Ed Smith, DEP. Just when the department looked over the presentation, I took it as restoration as an example and not limiting. And then I believe during the presentation, Donato did mention, continued focus on implementing SEP components, which are still in the works right now. Specifically, I think Blue Shanty Flowway is one of the ones that we mentioned. And then earlier we mentioned the Broward County Water Preserve Area impoundment, C11 impoundment. So I took that as Donato, even though he focused on restoration strategies in the bullet, he mentioned the other SEP components that we need to continue our focus on getting those implemented as this, potential strategies. Over.
Yeah, I'm not quarreling with those two ideas. I noted them myself, but it just, I believe that what you need to do is, if you're looking at cause and effect, if those projects that are apparently in the works, maybe soon to be approved, I don't know if they've been funded yet or not, but if those projects are expected to be the solutions, you're going to have to be, in my mind anyway, a lot more specific in linking the projects to in relation to your potential causes and why you believe they will be solutions. You may end up being wrong, you may end up being right, but if you believe they're solutions and they're going to be implemented, you put a timeline, you do a bit more than simply say continue implementing long-term solutions. I have no idea what that means. 2 years, 3 years, 5 years. And if we're going to have another exceedance this water year, and again, I'm not ruling out what's going to happen in August and September, but right now it's not looking good. I think you need to be a bit more proactive in identifying the projects that you believe will be solutions, and putting some meat on the bones, if you will, because right now this is pretty skeletal.
I definitely appreciate those comments, and we will definitely take that back and come back next time around with much more specificity. Thank you.
Well, I'm just referring to the memo that's attached to the materials as well, even from your principals. And it says, if there's no substantial evidence that the exceedance was due to error or extraordinary phenomena, has the TOC applied Appendix C to consider what additional remedies may need to be taken. And so that's where I think you need to focus on remedies and identify your options, and then demonstrate how they relate to the potential causes you've identified, whether it's a particular area, a particular portion of an area. But there's got to be some links made. Again, you may end up not being entirely correct, but you give it your best judgment and indicate, where you think remedies might solve whatever it is that's causing the exceedance from last year and what may be causing the exceedance that is going to occur this year if things continue along the trend that we've seen for the last 10 months. The generalities are what trouble me. I think you need to get a bit more specific, and you need to really focus on the language. What remedies will be taken?
Julie, this is Dan. If I could just chime in and just be very clear that from the federal perspective, we want to be clear that SERP and SEP are not corrective actions or remedies to achieve compliance with state requirements under either the consent decree or under restoration strategies. We fully acknowledge that the federal-state partnership for SERP is complementary to everything we're trying to do under restoration strategies and compliance with the consent decree, but these SERP projects are not designed to be corrective actions. Oh.
Understood. Thank you, Dan. And I did want to mention, since we're looking at this supposedly vague bullet point about restoration strategies, Mr. Burkett, when the TOC agreed that that was a remedy, I think it was for water year 2019, and even when restoration strategies was first started, if you will, it was recognized that it was going to take many years to fully implement all those actions. And those many years, I think, still have about 2 more years to go. So I just wanted to mention that up front here, because I think at the time we all thought that was pretty specific. And when I look at the consent orders and everything else, they seem pretty specific. And they have very specific timelines, which we haven't reached yet. And so I agree the bullet point is very general, but the specifics are spelled out. And if we need to bring those back to spell them out here, we certainly can do that.
Well, from my perspective, given my age, I don't have as good a memory. And so what happened 3 years ago, particularly with COVID in between, doesn't do much for me. If you're going to identify for this particular exceedance, what specific strategies you are now implementing that you believe will remedy the exceedance over time, you're going to have to be a lot more specific than just a bullet like that.
Makes sense. Thank you. Do we have other comments or questions for Donato before I launch into my bazillion?
This is Lori with the Refuge. Really no questions, Donato. I think you did a fantastic job of bringing a lot of data in a short presentation, so I'm going to still mull some of that over. But I do think, and I'm bringing this up to more of the 15,000 foot level, I think one of the most important things that Donato pointed out, talking about the 3 flowways that we have through 3A, and how we are seeing increasing water quality concerns for those flowways. So I think that's something really important to remember, because I know we don't want to or are trying not to use 3A to clean water. And it, from everything that we just saw, it looks like, some of these water quality issues are coming through 3A, and that, I don't think that's something that in the long term we want to continue. And I do think that and then I'm moving over to the local drivers. That was my regional comment. I do think that the S333 working group studies that Donato has under his 2 bullets there, or bullet number 2, that is. I do think, and I think I heard Donato March maybe of next year, they may be kind of wrapping up, maybe. But when they are, I do think we will have a lot more specificity. I think we really want to get through these studies and see what we have and kind of go from there. And then lastly, on more of a broader scale, I do think, and Donato's also pointed to this, I think in the 3rd bullet up there, is, it does beg us to kind of relook at COP, because COP does ask for water to move south. more times than not. And so hopefully we can do that along with the adaptive management, kind of relook at those, at the latest, I would say during SEP 1.0. That's it for me. Thanks.
Donato, just real quickly, I want to say thank you for the presentation. It was certainly a lot of information, as Lori said, that you distilled into a nice package. So thank you for that. Generally speaking, the department is going to agree with your ask here. We think that you've got it. We perhaps, to Mr. Barquette's point, we need to get more specific, and I think we can do that. The one question I did have is really on slides 17 and 18. And it's not a question about the information, but just to make sure I understand your conclusions, that there is a relationship, you're confirming that relationship between lower stage and increasing TP concentrations. Is that, did I read that correctly?
Yes, we see this inverse relationship, and the further we go, the stronger it gets.
Okay, so to that point, I think that highlights what was brought about by the principals in the 2019, where we all agreed upon that there was a localized issue that was causing the exceedance. And so that's where the department still stands. And then that goes straight to your last bullet, which is the adaptive management strategies within SEP 1.0. That's certainly an opportunity. And I think the key is we need to make sure we meet that opportunity by implementing these adaptive management strategies incrementally as the projects within SEP come along. So while the projects themselves may not be the remedy, it is perhaps the operational strategies of the system that can get to the remedies of the localized issue.
Thank you, Ed.
And just following up on, this is Dan from the Corps, following up on Ed's point, is the Corps is imminently embarking on the Central Everglades Planning Project Operational Planning Study 1.0. We expect that effort to get off the ground meaningfully within the next quarter. There'll be public scoping engagements where we're looking to get input from certainly all of our partners around the table here, as well as our external stakeholders and other partner agencies working on Everglades restoration. So there's certainly an opportunity. That study will, of course, account for other changes in the system that have happened since we implemented the combined operating, since the Corps and the Water Management District implemented the combined operating plan in September of 2020, to include the future planned 2023 revision to the Lake Okeechobee System Operating Manual, which will provide more water to the south, more clean water to the south, that will help to address some of these dry out concerns that we knew were prevalent at the time we implemented the COP project in 2020. And the timeline for the implementation of that SEP 1.0 study is approximately end of calendar year 2024. It's designed with the schedule to coincide with the completion of the Tamiami Trail Next Steps roadway modifications, which will allow us to put potentially more water into Northeast Shark River Slough as those roadway improvements are implemented. And we will very much, welcome the opportunity for all the agencies to participate in that process as we move forward. Over.
Thank you, Dan. I know this is going to seem kind of like a silly question, and I'm not sure everybody in the audience even knows the answer. What is the difference between SEP and SEP 1.0? That implies there's a 1.5 or a 2.
Julie, this is Dan again. Yeah, I'd be happy to answer that. So the major difference is that the combined operating plan was limited to the infrastructure that was completed through the federal modified water deliveries and C-111 Southdade project. So it's basically operating the infrastructure that was on the ground to put water into Everglades National Park prior to completion of CERT projects. And SEP 1.0 is the first operational study that is considering the completed features for the Central Everglades Planning Project that should, in the southern part of the system all be constructed between approximately now and 2028. So this operational study will cover the period of time where we're using additional water from Lake Okeechobee System Operating Manual, but using the SEP infrastructure to up to and including the full Blue Shanty flowway that Donato alluded to. The SEP 2.0 would be the next iteration of SEP that then considers the ability to move even more water south when the SEP EAA reservoir feature is completed in approximately 2030.
Thank you so much. Okay, so you guys covered some of my questions. I know Nenad had some comment on slide 5, and honestly, some of my questions, Donato, are kind of technical, like I want to look at data that we don't have in front of us. I'm just wondering if you would entertain working with some of my staff to kind of help dissect some of what you've presented today, and perhaps even some additional information that was maybe implied by some of Mr. Barquette's comments, because if we're looking at the cause of the water year 21 exceedance, I'm not clear we fully identified that. And I myself am really, really looking forward to the actual data that are being collected and developed as part of the sediment characterization and hydrodynamic studies. It looks like you've given us a little info from that this morning, which I really, really appreciate. I don't want to say I'm losing sleep waiting for that data, but I'm kind of anxious to see how that all pans out, and I'm kind of sorry it takes so long, but I do understand why it does.
I am open to working with your staff to dissect the analysis and definitely working with your staff to do the next steps of the evaluation.
That'd be great, thanks. Chelsea's sitting here going, more work for me. Oh, no, no. I'm not sure. We could probably spend 8 hours talking about your slides, and I don't really want to make everybody suffer through that. I will say I'm really, really happy you put this information together. I think it crystallizes maybe in my own mind some questions that I've had. And I was mentioning earlier to Chelsea, I've had a couple of questions I haven't quite written down or asked exactly, and I think you're helping me do that. And I appreciate your creative way in looking at some of this information. I think it's really helpful. And like I said, I would hope maybe we could work together in some ways to bring more information back to the TOC, hopefully even at the next meeting. I mean, we have a lot of data already. It's not that, you know, we have to wait until March or beyond December, so.
Sounds good to me, Julie. I'm all about more evaluation and making sure we completely understand the full story. I saw Ed's hand go up first. Sorry, Dan.
This will be quick. I just made a note while you're going through your presentation. You mentioned that the additional flow we're seeing, even though it's coming in at lower stage, you said it's great for ecology. And I was just curious, has the park done any evaluation to see if there's improvements in ecology? Have you seen any trends that you could report to the TOC? I think that would be interesting to see if you have it.
We have a staff member, Andrea Nelsantini, who's looking at Northeast Shark River Slough, and he's done a substantial evaluation of what's happened since incremental tests started happening. And we do see some ecological benefits of the operations that are occurring. We could definitely ask him to come and give a presentation on those and provide that detail.
Thank you. That would be great.
Hey, this is Dan with the Corps. I just want to, again, Donato, thank you for the very robust presentation from the Corps of Engineers perspectives. We also agree, we definitely see the same signal with the local drivers from water year 2019 as being apparent in the water year 21 exceedance. And so agree wholeheartedly with your recommendation that we continue the path forward to completion of the Park Services sediment characterization study and the water management district's hydrodynamic modeling study to help to look at potential options to proceed with what those next steps path forward should be. I think, to the point Julie just raised, I think if there's potentially an opportunity to share some of those results either at the December or the March meeting, then it may behoove us to consider bringing some of the details on the sediment characterization study and the hydrodynamic study to the December meeting, so that in the March meeting, when we're talking about the final results, we won't have to spin everyone up on the work that have come through that working group panel.
I cannot promise to bring results back in December. We're still in the process of having those evaluated. We don't expect to have them until December, so.
Yeah, again, my advocation is that this TOC meeting has not seen the actual work plans that were developed for either of the studies by either the National Park Service or the state. So my point was the December meeting may be an opportunity to give a high-level rundown on what's included in the work plan, so that in March, if there is an expectation that those analyses would be done, that we will have already kind of introduced the Technical Oversight Committee and the public to what those analysis entail, so that the March meeting we can then seamlessly move into the results if they are ready at that time. And obviously, I would expect that there will be separate engagements under the working group to continue as well in parallel with those public-facing processes.
I support that request or notion. I support that notion.
And this is Lori with the Refuge. I support it as well. We keep talking about the 333 working group, but, I don't think we've seen yet in this forum, we haven't seen yet anything about the studies. We have titles. So I love the idea that Dan has come up with. Let's look at the scope of work and just share that with the public, share that with all of us. And that way we'll have a better idea of what these mystery studies are. So great idea, Dan.
Okay, thank you all.
Yeah, this is Bill again. Given the information and the description of the studies and plans that I've heard, I can't think of anything else. The time frame is unfortunate, a little stretched out, but I can't think of anything else that could be implemented or studied, with the possible exception of addressing the high concentrations at SPA 5, which I think is going to need some work in the watershed, regional impoundments and BMPs. I know there are projects underway there, but I don't know much about them. So I think that's another topic for presentation.
Bill, what structure did you say?
The discharge from STA 5-6 is still very high, so concentration of phosphorus.
Thank you. Ed, I saw your hand go up.
I was just going to say he meant STA 5-6.
Oh.
I was confirming what he was saying. Thank you, Bill.
Thank you.
See, Donato sees Ed's hand go up. I see his finger on the mic. That's how we're doing this. So, all right. Anything else specific to Donato's presentation? And maybe we've already morphed into agenda item number 4, but I do want to kind of march on. If that's all right with everyone. Chelsea, you have your hand up.
First, thanks, Donato, for the great presentation. And also thank Dr. Walker and you brought wealth of information and look at data from different angle. I really appreciate it. And also I'm happy to hear Dr. Walker after absence from a few meetings. So one thing I want to comment is the vector map that shows flow direction from the north and western boundaries. But specific to influence to the downstream S12s, we look at the marsh TP concentrations. They have been consistent low and didn't really indicate influence from the north and western boundaries. And particular for S12C, D, and S33, S33N, they were primarily used for sending flow to Shark River Slough. Like S12A and B were closed most of the time, only used, like allowed to open 2.5 months, and their contributions limited. But for S12C and D, also in the tilt current meter shows that the flow direction is from the eastern side, L67A to west to L29 Canal. So I think it's the influence to compliance results to the exceedance results from the north and the western boundaries are very limited. At least the marsh data really didn't show that. And for the S9 structure, we did look at the concentration flow in mean concentration, also compared to the downstream S333, similar as we showed in the eastern inflow. If you just focus on the S9 TP concentration, it actually shows the similar trend when you compare to the downstream. So when the stage was high, the S9 TP concentration usually generally higher than S333 because S33 downstream TP concentration is driven by stage. So when stage were high, they were low sometimes, like in early water year 2021, it's in the 5 to 7 parts per billion range. So the S9 were definitely higher. But when stage were low, below 9.2 feet, we saw the same phenomena. Like the downstream TP concentration were higher than S9. That's the thing I just want to clarify.
Oh, I appreciate your comments. I wasn't trying to make a one-to-one relationship between upstream dynamics and the things that we're seeing at S333. The point of the regional drivers was to discuss the fact that they haven't gotten clean to the point that they are protective of what's going into Shark River Slough. So I'm not at the point where I can eliminate them as drivers of what we're still seeing. For me, they're still contributing to the load that's in the canal, and we're also seeing that we still have a legacy load that's in the canal as well, and whatever's coming off the localized areas along the marsh. So I wasn't trying to point at a one-to-one relationship with the regional, and you'll notice my presentation focused heavily on the local drivers of what we're seeing, particularly for the spiking conditions you just described for the 333 structure, as well as the S12C this year around. So I appreciate your comments. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, Chelsea, this is Lori with the Refuge. So when you say you've checked TP in the marsh, are you just talking about down by the S12s, or are you looking at like a vector all the way up to, the northwest part of 3A?
I think the SFER chapters 3 shows the WCA3 marsh station, all the marsh stations. They were consistently low.
And that's consistent with what we're seeing at the S12C and B, because that's what flows off the marsh and it captures those signals. So I think that's consistent with what we're seeing.
The thing in marsh itself, the numbers are consistently low. So perhaps you guys are looking at around the fringes of the marsh, and we would have to go back and look at that data if we have it. I just kind of wanted to throw that out there. I actually printed and brought part of the last chapter 3 here to kind of remind myself. And I'm looking at this map here that folks can look up, or we'll show it at the next meeting. But, it looks like the numbers in the Conservation Area 3 itself are actually pretty good. So, and again, the map I'm looking at is the TP rule. So those are interior stations. I did have another comment or question, Donato. It links a little bit back to what you and Chelsea were just discussing, because on slide 8, you're showing some annual values, which is really great. I'm just wondering if we were to start looking at, and maybe you did, but you've noted for 1 year, some part of the S333 discharges were routed around Shark River Slough. I don't know if you looked at that for all of these. And then my other question was whether or not we looked at time of year or which months these things happened in those years. Because, I mentioned earlier I'm formulating a bunch of questions in my head, and some of them really do relate to history and looking at a few more details of history, knowing that implementation of COP, we're certainly operating a bit differently now, but I'm assuming looking at that type of information, we would hopefully see some sort of inflection point. So I just wanted to add that in. I think some of this is information that could be looked at and perhaps brought back here.
This is Lori again with the refuge. And so this is back to Chelsea and maybe even Stuart. As we look at our TOC meeting notes from the last meeting, there's an excerpt in here on page 4 of 5 where Stuart Van Horn elaborated, water from the western flowway moves across 3A marsh, and by the time it reaches the southern end of 3A, the water has very low phosphorus concentrations. To me, that sounds like cleaning. So I don't know, you know what I mean? So that's so that's where I was going with that comment.
Yeah, this is Bill again. I don't think we consider the concentrations at S12A, which is more directly connected with the flow down the western flow path, as low. So I mean, I think the point is the spatial pattern showing the transport, and not so much the magnitude of sort of the average concentrations in the marsh.
Well, I keep going back to S12A is closed a great deal of the year. And so that's a little frustrating, I guess, from my perspective to look at S12A and S12B that are closed a lot of the time if the values are higher there, but very small contribution to the overall compliance, if you will.
Well, I would look at load, perhaps, but I agree the magnitude of the flow are low, but that doesn't mean that they wouldn't, that they aren't a factor.
Okay. Boy, there's been a lot of really good questions today. You're testing us, Lori. Donato, it is a great presentation that you gave, and I think there's a lot of food for thought as in future presentations, the questions that are coming up, maybe we need to try and just address them a little bit better in presentations. Just off the top of my head, some of the questions that you're asking are, they're related, but they're also compartmentalized in the sense that, let's say for all the water conservation areas, US EPA has approved a water quality standard, which is a 10 parts per billion measured across an array of stations, which have been deemed representative of the marsh conditions. So when you start seeing across and there's 2 station sets, there's an impacted and an unimpacted. And we know in area 3A that a couple of the stations that are in the very northern northwest corner are still high above 10. They're up in 15, 20 parts per billion, at least minimum. So we know that that's an ongoing issue with the discharges from STA 5 and 6, that, that facility has to do better so that its discharges do not cause or contribute to, in water quality standards parlay, that it doesn't cause or contribute to violations of the water quality standard in the receiving water body. But what we see across pretty much the entire network in 3A with that established network is that it's collected on a monthly basis, and it's consistently very good numbers, 6 parts per billion and lower, probably 2/3 of the way up down to 4, sometimes 3 in the very southern end. So those are things that I think we probably just need to do a better job in explaining. And what you were talking about from my previous discussion at the last TOC meeting was that from the state's perspective, we acknowledge that there are still things that need to be done to ameliorate the higher levels of TP that's being discharged into the western sides. And that's, restoration strategies need to continue. Ed had talked about WRP. There was some discussion about WRP. Those are future projects, and that will also help. So it's just connecting the dots. And if we're, yes, we can see the flow patterns. Yes, we know there's flow volume coming from certain areas. And Donato's presentation, yes, we see the signals from the ratio, but we know that most of the water coming into water conservation area that is surface water inflow is coming from north, right? It's going north to south. So the ratios may indicate that, but it's the delivery of the water, where are we seeing it? And it seems like pretty much everything is pointing to what we're working on, which is what's going on in the canals and the sediments. And it's a very disturbed system, right? You look at 3A, and it used to be no canals cut through it. And whatever was in the bottom flock and sediment, the detritus and peat that's been built up over all those years, it probably barely moved. And it was, it's surface water flowing across. And now we've got a canal system, which the dynamics have completely changed. And, the focus on that is really important. So, yeah, I think we probably need to do a little bit of a better job in the future on connecting some of these dots to address these questions. We'd be happy to do that. And I'm glad we're going to work with you to be able to do that.
Thank you, Stuart.
Okay, do we have more discussion? Our agenda item number 4 was really to go through the 3 questions, and I'm not clear at this moment if you guys want to go through the 3 questions, so you'll have to help me out here. We can certainly delay if you'd like. Perhaps in light of Mr. Barquette's comments, also looking for some specifics, but if you don't mind, maybe we could launch. Because the first couple of questions might be a little easier for us to answer than the third one. The first question was whether or not we've sufficiently evaluated the relevant information for a better understanding of what may have caused the exceedance. And maybe leading to that, have we determined at a minimum here that there's substantial evidence that the exceedance is due to error or extraordinary natural phenomena? And I'm just going to kind of roll those 2 questions together at the moment. I'm hearing that we probably have some more work to do, but that may lead us more toward the answer to the third question than these first 2. So any feedback from you all on our first 2 questions?
This is Dan on behalf of the Corps. I think it's very clear that from the presentations at last TOC and this TOC that the exceedance is not the result of an extraordinary natural phenomena or a data error. I think that the answer to number 1 in some ways is still contingent on the analysis that's being done by the 333 working group. I think we've done a fair amount of digging with the information that is at our fingertips and that we present at these TOC quarterly meetings. But I think there's an entire other set of data that's being collected in part because of the expertise from the agencies sitting around this table that have developed that hydrodynamic work plan and the sediment characterization study. So I think to really get to the bottom of question 1, I think we need to complete the work that we started after the 2019 exceedance, since we see many of the same signals evident in the local drivers here with the 21 exceedance. And then once we have that answer in hand, we will be better positioned to circle back on number 3 and decide where do we go from here.
Okay, thank you. Lori?
Can I say ditto?
Yeah, because I'm thinking that in my own head here. That's okay.
Well, I'm going to say ditto. Dan just put it well. I couldn't say it any better.
Yeah, I'll go. So, like Lori just said, Dan put it really well. The only thing I would add is we had a lot of discussion about my presentation here and commitment to do more work together. So I think that kind of slows down number one already. I think there's more has to be done in addition to what Dan pointed out with the sediment and hydrologic characterizations.
Okay, Ed, any comments?
I would just echo Dan's comments on the second question. You know, we can say confidently that there wasn't data error and it wasn't a sampling issue. So it's not an extraordinary natural phenomenon that caused the exceedance. And yeah, same to that, to his same point that, you know, we recognize there's a localized issue going on, and we need to do whatever we can to get to the bottom of that localized issue so we can start coming up with the remedies.
So I agree with all of you. I was worried, like you would say you had sufficiently evaluated the data, and I would say, I don't know. All right, so I don't think we're going to go to question 3 unless somebody is chomping at the bit to do that today. Okay. So where we've landed for agenda item number 4, just to make this official, is the TOC has determined there is no evidence of extraordinary natural phenomena or error that contributed to the exceedance for water year 21. I will expound a little here. I think we will have our staff work together offline and come back at the next TOC meeting, hopefully with information related to the data that we do have available. I am still very anxious personally to see even raw data from the sediment study, to be honest with you, but I understand processes are processes, so we can wait. I imagine there are folks in our audience today who are looking for us to do something, and so we're just not quite ready to do that, is what I'm seeing. And I get to see you guys nod your heads up and down. This is great. Lori.
But I do want to bring the scope of work from the 333 working group. So if we can get that on our list, just so that everybody understands, just a broad overview of where they're headed.
Okay, I think we've talked about that before, and we were looking for our principals to give us some guidance on that about bringing it in here. So I do want to throw that out there, but I don't blame you for asking, and we can look at that as a tentative agenda item for our next meeting. Anything else for our meeting today? We didn't really land. However, we've got a couple of people in our audience who've had their hands up, so I do want to call on folks for public comment. And I have to mute my mic to reach over and check your name. So hang on one second. Okay, our first person who wishes to make public comments is Paul Julian. We could please unmute Paul.
Sound check.
We gotcha.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Paul Julian, SCCF and Conservancy of Southwest Florida. I thought I heard my ears ringing earlier, but this it's good. Donato, thanks for all that information. It's a lot to kind of chew on, and it's a really great perspective of looking at both, you know, concentrations as well as trends and kind of the potential drivers associated with it. It's a really good look at things. What really strikes me is the total phosphorus concentrations for 2021, as well as the seasonal trend tests on the western side of Water Conservation Area 3A, seem to line up pretty closely to an effort that I've been doing, working on a space and time model looking at changes in phosphorus concentrations across the area using a combination of the structure data as well as the marsh data. And I know we've had in-depth conversation about marsh concentrations today, and I'm not going to get into it, but ultimately the preliminary work that this model is showing is that there's a really strong positive effect coming from the western side of Water Conservation Area 3A, as in, you know, the L20 or 29 interceptor, you know, the gap all the way down along that side is contributing a significant concentration of phosphorus to the region. That's a pretty big deal. I think, or a pretty interesting finding at least, because we can no longer discount that portion of the system, contributing or not, to the overall contributions to water conservation area 3A. Also, the S9A trends, from what I remember, digging into the data, and I'm not a water manager or an engineer by any means, but I think the trends in 9A are a fact, or an artifact that the way that complex is being operated has changed over the years. So historically, S9A was turned on and it would flow a lot of water very quickly and abruptly, affecting water quality. And since the installation and operation of S9A is a little bit smaller, a little bit easier to manage. And so it's being used a little bit more frequently. And so it's moving more water probably than historically, obviously. So I think that could explain some of those trends. Maybe, I don't know if there's basin changes that have contributed phosphorus per se, but that's a potential as well. And then looking at your slide, I think it's 18 and 17 with the delta S333 headwater sage versus TP concentration. I think I'm having flashbacks or nightmares to pre-2019 when we were discussing this in depth ad nauseum about the potential effects water quality wise associated with that. And it's a really cool way you put it together. It really brings home that the further we get away from that 9.2 as in below it, the higher the concentrations occur. And so, as you pointed out, the adaptive management perspectives of that could help fix or pad that a little bit, knowing that this relationship exists and has existed for quite some time. I think it's something great, that a nice way to show it again and really hammer home that point. And that's it. I don't want to take up any more time, so I really appreciate it, and thanks for the opportunity to comment.
Thank you, Dr. Julian. Our next person who has their hand up is Ernie Barnett. Hi, Ernie.
Thank you, Julie. This is Ernie Barnett. I would be remiss if I didn't, sort of at the risk of being repetitive, bring up what I mentioned at the last TOC meeting. I think an overarching issue that's not being addressed is the fact that when the compliance methodology for both Appendix A and Appendix B were established, it was a surrogate for what the water quality conditions were with the designation of an outstanding Florida waters. And it was based upon the loads and flows and concentrations that were coming in at very discrete inflow points at the southern end of the system in the case of Appendix A. And so when you look at what has happened in the last 3 decades since that establishment of the OFW, and then the good work that Dr. Walker and others did in establishing the Appendix A formula, there's been significant changes throughout the system, not the least of which is in every direction upstream, significant amounts of source controls, load reductions, and construction of large-scale public works like the STAs to reduce the loads and inflows. So it's a little puzzling of why you would see excursions or exceedances when water quality by and large has dramatically improved in all directions. At the S9A, Dr. Julian's correct, the construction of the smaller pump station has resulted in incredible reductions in loads coming from Western Broward County. The same with the Everglades agricultural area. What is not being discussed, I think, is the fact that the compliance methodology was based upon entirely different flow regimes and operational changes that have taken place over the years. The modified water deliveries, the raising of Tamiami Trail, construction of entirely new pump stations and new discharge points into the park, as well as the COP plan and the interim operating plan prior to that, have really shifted the flows and loads from the west to the east. And I don't believe the compliance formula has any statistical valid merit to actually measuring what is compliance with the original intent of the settlement agreement. And until a new formula is established that was based upon the historic loads and flows that were to be reduced, which we've seen, and matched up to where they now flow, I think you're going to continue to have these predictable exceedances, which aren't violations of water quality standards. They're not violations and I'm fairly convinced aren't causing any water quality problems in the park. What is happening is, I believe this old arcane methodology is being interpreted more like a liquidated damages contract that was entered into, yet all the underlying conditions in the intervening period of time have been changed by others to sort of set it up to not meet those numbers, not because more pollution is entering the system or more loads are coming into the system or more impacts are happening to the park, but it just doesn't adequately represent what's the changes. And I would argue the operational changes are causing the exceedances, and that may not be a bad thing because those operational changes are needed to accomplish restoration and are not causing water quality impacts downstream. So I just urge y'all to put a little more time, energy, and effort in looking at the compliance methodology. I think what you'll find is that the operational changes are having a much stronger impact. What was presented today demonstrates that, and just hope that there's not a rush to judgment to try to find some other remedy when in fact the actions of the combined efforts of the agencies sitting at the table in changing the operational flows and protocols may be causing, quote unquote, not meeting the numbers that are in the formula, but not necessarily causing any kind of water quality impact or violation. So, and this goes back, we predicted this at the Water Management District and while I was at DEP, that these flow changes would cause the appendix not to be met, said it as a department and district employee over the years. And sadly, I'm seeing I'm not Cassandra the prophet, but I'm seeing those predictions come true when these routine and predictable excursions occur. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Barnett. Do we have anyone else from the public? Let's see, I saw a hand go up. No, I didn't see a hand go up. Anybody else from the public want to make any comment? Let's do some closing business, and then if we have other closing comments from the reps or Mr. Barnett, let's go that way if you guys are okay. Closing business is we have to pick a next meeting date. So we have three possibilities. I know everyone has mentioned December 100 times already today, but there is also a date available in November. So we're looking at November 15th or December 13th or December 20th for the next quarterly meeting. Any preferences here? Okay, so we've knocked her off the list because we have a lot of work to do, which I agree with. What about December 13th or 20th? I know the 20th is getting really close to the Christmas holidays. Comments, preferences, you guys?
Well, I was going to say November 15th or December 13th. I just think the 20th, family hasn't decided, vacation before or after, Christmas. I think that one just may be iffy with the holiday. So I guess go with the 13th.
Yeah, December 13th works for me.
Yeah, from the core, December 13th is a good date.
It is for me too. What about you, Barnett? Can you make the 13th of December? Mr. Barnett, if you're speaking, we can't hear you.
That works for me. I'm sorry. Did you address that to me? I apologize.
That's okay. Yeah. Okay. So our next meeting will be December 13th. And Donato will, I'll have Chelsea and Nenad maybe get together with you and you guys could do some work together. I think that would be really great. We would appreciate that. I don't have more closing remarks except to say, great presentation, Donato. A lot of food for thought, and I certainly appreciate that. And any other closing remarks from the reps for today?
Hey, Donato, I'll second Julie's comment about your presentation. It was very good. It was obviously very thought-provoking, so thank you for that. I would like to ask if we can to include, DEP's water quality folks in those discussions going forward.
Okay, and that would be Mylene and Luke, I assume? Okay, great, thank you. So we'll circle the wagons and make that happen. Anything else, you guys?
This is Dan with the Corps. No closing remarks. Again, I want to appreciate Donato's presentation today, Chelsea's presentation at the last meeting. I think collectively it's got our heads thinking about all the right questions to ask. So just want to say thank you and look forward to, I would also echo Ed's point. I do want to make sure the water quality team at the Corps is also involved in that table. And that's going to be Jim Riley and Ken Bradshaw and myself as well.
Thank you.
No, same.
Okay.
As far as being a part of the effort. And thank you, Stuart, for entertaining my question. So thank you for that.
Okay, any other remarks from you, Mr. Barquette, as we close?
No, I found today to be quite interesting, and I appreciate all the efforts that everyone's making. I know we're all working towards the same goal, but again, I want to repeat what I said before. You've got to get a bit more specific and focused in terms of the why and the what and the how and that sort of thing. So I know you're moving in that direction. I think you have the time, but you just have to demonstrate in your submissions that in fact you do understand the mission and you're working towards it.
Okay, thank you very much. And for all of you who are here or in person or virtually, thank you for attending today. We will close the meeting and see you guys in December. Thank you.